So in part one, we talked about how Jon Snow seems to be linked to Ashara Dane in some way. And in part two, we talked about how the Promise has no correlation to Jon, but seems to have some sort of connection to Daenerys. And so we put forward an alternative theory, R plus L equals D, and B plus A equals J. But does it work in the timeline of Robert's Rebellion? Well, let's be frank. The Robert Rebellion timeline is a mess. It's front-loaded and back-loaded with events with nothing happening in the middle, and armies racing around the map at ungodly speeds. What do I mean? Well, this is roughly Robert's Rebellion's timeline. After Brandon dies, the war begins. Our trio of Jon, Arryn, Robert, and Ned start out in the Vale, but quickly set out on three different paths. Jon Arryn seems to have a battle at Gulltown. Robert goes home to Storm's End, calls his banners, and then fights battles at Summerhall and Ashford. Ned, according to Godric Burrell, went home to Winterfell to call his banners, but this is very hard to fit in the timeline as marching soldiers from the north would take forever. Godric also said that Ned fathered a bastard, so we're not sure about his testimony. The next event is the Battle of the Bells, which is immediately followed by Ned and Kat's marriage and the conception of Robb. So we know at the beginning of Robert's Rebellion, the North, the Vale, and the Stormlands rose up against the Crown. The Reach and Dorne were fighting for the crown, so the most critical thing for the rebels to do was to ensure the Riverlands were on their side. And this is a huge reason why I don't think Ned went home to Winterfell to raise his banners, at least not at the beginning of the war. Securing the Tully alliance is way more important. Ned needs to get married to Catelyn fast. But before Ned gets married, for some reason everybody fights in this Battle of the Bells. Because securing the Tully alliance is so critical, this should be close to the beginning of the war. I'm not sure why they didn't get married before the battle, but Catelyn says it was after. Now, I placed the Battle of the Bells in the third month of the war based on the following completely insane travel calculations. So we know in A Game of Thrones, Tyrion and Jon spend at minimum 3 weeks of hard riding to get from Winterfell to the Wall. For the hell of it, I think I'm going to call this distance a wall to fell. We learned in A Dance with Dragons that marching takes twice as long as hard riding. Now yes, we have terrain issues, so I imagine that riding around in the flat Riverlands is quicker than riding around in the north or the Dornish Mountains, but let's try to keep this simple for now. A wall to fell is 3 weeks hard riding or 6 weeks marching. Now the Battle of the Bells takes place at Stony Sept, which is about 2.5 wall to fells from Winterfell. This means if we had to wait for Ned to go back to Winterfell and then for ground forces to make it to Stony Sept, we're looking at the Battle of the Bells being in the 5th month of the war. But that doesn't make very much sense, as Dornish forces are said to be marching up the King's Road during the Battle of the Bells, and that distance is only about 1.5 wall to fells. Putting all these calculations aside, it makes no sense that Northern forces would arrive at the war before Dornish forces. Simply put, Dorne had a much shorter distance to walk. Time-wise, it makes more sense that Ned was there without his forces, or at least without his ground forces. Cavalry could get there in half the time, which would put the battle in the 3rd month of the war. But Robert was also at the Battle of the Bells, and he had to fight a battle at Summerhall and then Ashford before heading to Stony Sept. This is about 1.5 wall to fells in distance, and if we add on Robert's time in the Vale, we're looking at the Battle of the Bells being in the 3rd month through the Robert calculation. It's still pretty fast, but based on the Dornish movement, Robert's movement, and the urgency of a Tully wedding, the 3rd month seems like a prudent guess. Now supporters of R plus L equals J really like the idea of the Battle of the Bells being in the 3rd month. If Ned and Kat can conceive Robb right after the battle, and Jon is just a little bit younger than Robb, then Jon can be born around the time of the sack of King's Landing. And there is an infamous 1999 email from Martin in which he says that Dany is probably 8 to 9 months younger than Jon. If Dany was conceived right before the sack of King's Landing, that means Jon would be born right around the sack of King's Landing. But here's the thing, that doesn't leave any time for Ned to get to the Tower of Joy. After the sack of King's Landing, Ned marches his forces to Storm's End to lift the siege there. That's about 2/3 of a wall to fell, so that should take about a month by foot. After that, Ned rides through the mountains of Dorne to find the Tower of Joy, which is about a wall to fell, so tack on another 3 weeks. Not to mention it's mountainous terrain, and it's a place he's never been before. So if you subscribe to R plus L equals J, you have to accept that it was a really fast trip to Storm's End and then the Tower. Now what about the alternative? Does it work out? Well, if we accept that Jon was conceived right before the beginning of the war, he'd be born sometime in the 9th month. Ned would have oodles of time to get down to Storm's End, and would have plenty of time to wander the mountains of Dorne searching for the Tower of Joy. But there is a major hurdle to this theory as well. Ned would need to pass off Jon as being 3 months younger than he actually is. After all, if Ned is telling everyone that he broke his marriage vow, he must also be telling them that Jon is younger than Robb. Would anyone buy it? Well, that all depends on how old Jon is when he brings him back. If Dany is born at the Tower of Joy, Jon is 8 to 9 months old at the time. But then Ned has to head to Starfall, back to King's Landing, and then to Riverrun. All in all, about 3 Waldefells. And it's probably slower going with a baby in his arms. The point being, when Ned finally returns to Riverrun with Jon, Jon may be over a year old, with a greater possibility of being passed off as younger. So yes, R plus L equals D, B plus A equals J fits in the timeline. In fact, it fits better than R plus L equals J. Ned actually has time to get to Storm's End and the Tower of Joy. However, it does require Ned to pass off a child as being younger than he actually is. Now, anyone who's spent time with 1-year-olds or children in that age range knows that they can vary greatly in size and development. So while passing Jon off as 3 months younger is a hurdle for Ned, it's certainly in the realm of possibility. On a side note, I wonder what all those armies were doing in between the Battle of the Bells and the Battle of the Trident. I mean, it's about 7 months of people doing nothing. Ah well, fuck it. Finally, let's talk about the Kingsguard. Now, some would argue that because the Kingsguard is at the Tower of Joy, there must be a king at the tower. Otherwise, the Kingsguard would be off to Dragonstone to protect Viserys. According to this theory, it couldn't be Daenerys at the Tower of Joy because she's a girl and comes behind Viserys in the line of succession. Now, there's many problems with this theory. The Kingsguard have many vows, so there's many reasons for them to be at the tower. I call this the Jaime dilemma. They could have many reasons for being at the tower that are honorable. As Jaime tells us, with so many vows, you're forsaking one vow or the other. Perhaps they're keeping a secret, and that comes before going to Dragonstone. A subset of the Jaime dilemma is the Barristan dilemma. What if you're given an order that goes against protecting the king? Barristan was told to stand aside as Robert fought a boar. The boar killed him. Did Barristan break his vows? Ned didn't think so. So when the Kingsguard are at the tower, they may just be following orders. The third problem is dispatch. Barristan Selmy specifically tells us that Kingsguard can be dispatched to protect others, including lovers and bastards. So the Kingsguard could be assigned to protect anyone. The fourth problem is the daughter question. Rhaegar's naming scheme for his children implies that he was expecting a daughter named Visenya. So it looks like the Kingsguard were fully expecting to protect a girl. The fifth problem is martyrdom is not protection. The Kingsguard famously say that they do not flee, but that's not actually the best course of action for protecting a baby. Running away or negotiating with Ned seems like a much better strategy than trying to win a 7-on-3 fight. Arthur Dayne is even Dornish. Seems like it would be easy for him to escape with a baby in Dorne. And Ned is the baby's uncle. Why not talk the whole thing out? The sixth problem is fortification. A tower by its very nature is something that gives you a military advantage. Why isn't it being used? The seventh problem is polygamy. Rhaegar is already married, so any child he has with Lyanna is considered a bastard in the faith of the Seven. And in the world of Ice and Fire, knights by definition swear vows to the faith. Only 2 Targaryens ever practiced polygamy in Westeros, and that was 250 years ago. And the eighth problem is irrelevance. Rhaegar is fulfilling prophecy and trying to save the world, and the Kingsguard know this. Who cares about who sits the Iron Throne? So if the Kingsguard aren't protecting a king, why are they there? Well, they might just be protecting secrets, but I believe they're there because they're 3 individuals, not because they're Kingsguard. Arthur Dayne is Rhaegar's most trusted friend, so of course he's going to be at the tower. Oswell Went already conspired with Rhaegar to set up the Harrenhal tourney, and Harrenhal is filled with all sorts of old mystical books, so it's very likely House Went knows about these prophecies. The only wild card is Gerald Hightower, but he comes from one of the oldest and most mysterious houses in Westeros. The house practices sorcerous arts. His nephew Leighton Hightower has been doing nothing but studying magic and prophecy for the past decade, so it sounds like House Hightower has the skinny on this whole prophecy thing. But it almost seems like the Kingsguard are looking to die at the tower. Now that's a great way to keep secrets, but it almost seems like a sacrifice. It would explain why they didn't run, or negotiate, or use the tower, or do anything that would actually protect a baby. And Qyburn tells us that blood magic is the most powerful form of magic out there. One of the Kingsguard's vows happens to be their lives for the monarch. And that's all I have to say about the tower, although I'm probably wrong about half of it. We hardly know anything about these events, and I guarantee we're all going to be surprised. And for next time, we're going to talk about why on earth would Drogo marry Dany?